Welcome to another edition of the NCBI podcast. I'm June Tinsley, Head of Communications and Advocacy with NCBI, and I'm joined today by Robert Thompson, who is a service user of NCBI and is now retired, having previously been working in the insurance business. And he's obviously going to give us some insights to his own life living with no sight, and also insights into tips and guides he would offer other people who are new to living with low vision or no vision. So welcome, Robert, and thanks for joining us.
Hello, and thank you for having me on.
I suppose just to outline to our listeners, would you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I am currently retired. I worked all my life as a sort of most people regard as a normal job. I worked in the insurance business and didn't have any sight problems other than perhaps a weak right eye. I drove a car as part of my work for a good number of years, and towards the end of the 1990s, my sight was losing a bit, but I was still driving and still working. And I then coming towards the more end of my career, although I retired a little bit early, primarily because I was having to go to meetings when lots of figures and information was put in front of you and you were expected to read them in a hurry. And I was just that bit slow at that sort of stuff. So I was struggling with that. And besides, I had 37 years done at that stage. So I did a deal with my employer and got early retirement, which was very welcome at the time. Now, having done that, at that stage, I had to give up driving. My sight was giving me that much difficulty, all right. But then I did some consultancy work. Having worked in the insurance industry, in the claims area in particular, I did some consultancy work for the Motor Insurers Bureau of Ireland and worked there for another 5 or 6 years, at which time I still wasn't able to drive. I was able to manage other things quite normally, really. But then the big hit came in 2007. When I say a big hit, it didn't happen overnight. It happened over a period of about 2 months, which to me was quite sudden. But my sight went from a level of being able to read to not being able to read, from being able to watch TV to not being able to watch TV, to not being able to see buses coming and things like that. So that was a major event in my life at that stage. And that changed the course of my life from there.
2 months is a very short period of time, to be fair. So tell us, how did you adjust to that?
Well, initially it hit me like a ton of bricks because I lived a fairly active life and I was suddenly confronted with not being able to do normal things. And I went through a time of, I suppose, depression and adjustment to that. But over time, I did get on top of it. I suppose one of the things that turned my whole focus was to begin to think of things that I was able to do beforehand that I might still be able to continue doing. And I suppose the thing that turned it for me in particular was my son's wedding was coming up, and I, of course, as father of the bride, would have to make a speech. Now, I had done many of those in business before, but always with notes. But now I had to work without that, and that made me begin to think, how can I do this? So I just worked on it and committed it to memory and did it, and that was the first thing that turned me around to say that, look, I can do some of the things that I used to do before.
Yes.
Went from there to doing small DIY jobs because that was also within my kind of life before that, like quite big time actually, before that. So I turned my hand to some of those sort of things and learned how to use saws without cutting my fingers and hammer without hammering my fingers and so on. And other means of measuring without having to depend on being able to read a measuring tape and things like that. So gradually I worked on those and got back into circulation a bit again. And that was sort of the way I began to turn around from this kind of level of sudden loss and depression into being able to find myself being more useful or more involved in life.
And to be fair, Robert, the book that you have written, Insights into an Unsighted World, which we'll talk about in a second, is very inspiring, and it is very practical as well. but certainly the area you alluded to there about the DIY and stuff, I think it sounds as if you're totally underselling what you accomplished in the projects you were connected with your local church. Can you tell us a bit more about those?
Yes, well, just by way of background, I've always had an interest in DIY and have done quite significant things. Like years ago, I built my own house, and I did some building project with my brother. Now, that wasn't my job, of course, but that was just a sideline.
Yes.
But that's the background to that. I have been involved with my local church for all of my adult life, shall we say, and I've done a number of projects there as well. But more recently, and this is much more recently now than 2007, this is only about 2 years ago, we were doing quite a major extension at our church, and I project managed that. Now, this was a large project, as in a €1 million project, but I managed that through the architects and everybody else who was involved. But it was done partly by engaging a contractor to do it, but a large part of it we did ourselves, which was more challenging from my point of view, in that I had to coordinate all the different tradespeople to do the various pieces, and I managed costing and that sort of stuff. Some of the work I did myself with others, because I could still do lots of this sort of stuff, yes, even though I couldn't see a whole lot. So that worked out very satisfactorily, and everybody was delighted with the end result, because we saved a lot of money by doing it that way. So that was very satisfying, I must say.
Very much so, and it certainly sounds as if not only are you very determined, but you certainly can turn your hand to adapting to different ways of working. And also, I'm sure it was quite illuminating for many of the tradesmen that you were connected with. They possibly wouldn't have come across someone who is blind to be able to do as many tasks as you were doing.
Yeah, I had to gain their confidence first.
Yes, I'm sure.
Many of them kind of say, yeah, kind of who's he type of thing. He can't see. But very soon they realized that I could feel an awful lot of things and hear a lot of things that they would never have realized. Because, for example, you can hear carpenters, you can hear different people, and I go around afterwards and feel like carpentry has been done to make sure it feels right, and lots of things like that. And some people would obviously help me out with describing things and tell me what's here and what's there, and that worked well. I also, of course, had to convince the architects and the building contractors that I could manage to work off plans. Now, I couldn't see the plans at all, but I memorized the details from previous discussions, and then was able to keep on top of the development as it went forward. But yeah, once you gain the respect and they know that you know what you're talking about, then you can get on with the job.
Fabulous, but I think it's possibly also an opportunity for them to now challenge their own perceptions as they are engaged in future roles, either in professional or personal lives, and that's certainly something to be welcomed. Yeah,
I certainly hope it has done. Certainly, any of them that come in contact with me now, as they'll be back to do other bits of things here and there, they immediately kind of know how to approach me and how to like just make allowance for the fact that I can't see, but yet I know what I'm talking about in terms of the piece of work that's in hand.
Correct. And tell us, what prompted you to write your book, Insights into an Unsighted World?
Well, switching way back again to just post 2007, I have a number of friends and family who have turned out to be excellent guides. And this is long before I got my guide dog, which is only much more recently. So I have some people who are excellent at guiding, and I had one friend in particular who was excellent at this, but of course they have to learn as well as I do as to the things to do and not to do. And one day with this lady, I was approaching a set of steps, and she said to me, well, of course I didn't know that because I couldn't see them, but she said to me, we're approaching steps. So of course the obvious question, are they going up or are they going down? Which is sort of important when you can't see which way the steps are going.
True.
Bit of a nasty act. So she said, oh yes, I never thought of that. So then she began to pick up a number of things like this that I was telling her, or she was saying to me, which weren't perhaps as clear as they might be. And she was learning very quickly, and she said, you should write a book about this. So I parked that thought for a year or two, and then I started making notes of all these bits and pieces. of things which I felt would be very useful, not just for people losing their sight, but also for friends and family of people who have lost sight or are going through that process, as to how best to guide them and interact with them. So I put all that together into a series of tips, and then I decided that maybe there's a possibility to publish this, but it was a bit, what should we say, too textbook on its own, although it's written in a light-hearted fashion. But I thought it might be wise to add some personal stories of events in my life, which just amusing events. So I added them to the second half of the book to make the book. And then, of course, more recently, I went to a second edition, which I included a piece about that building project I just mentioned. And also I got my guide dog. So I'd written a piece at the end of that called It's a Dog's Life, which is a longish piece about life as seen to the eyes of a guide dog, as to how a guide dog operates, which many people have found quite amusing and interesting and instructive and informative as well. So that's been the story of my book.
Yeah, to be fair, the tone of the book is very informative yet informal, and I suppose that's what's so enjoyable about it, because not only does it provide those kind of tips on how you can interact with people who are blind and vision impaired and their guide dogs, but also peppered throughout it is obviously your own personal experience, and I suppose that's what's so human about it. I suppose my next question really would be in terms of, is there any particular advice you'd give to somebody who's recently received a diagnosis of sight loss?
Yeah, well, I suppose it depends on whether this is sudden loss, as in immediate loss, or over time. My sight deteriorated from that first time in 2007 to where it is at the moment, from being able to see bits at that time to pretty well nothing now. So I had the advantage of learning as I went along. But if that's your situation, then I would say that all is not lost. There's plenty that people can turn their hand to. I would think in particular, I would encourage people to think of the things that they used to be able to do or used to like doing or be good at before they lost their sight, and see, are there ways in which you can adapt to do that? Now, clearly, if you liked driving, you won't be able to drive anymore, but there are lots of things, like I was able to adapt some of my DIY stuff to be able to continue doing it. I'd say focus quite a lot of energy on that. And the other advice I would say is, depending on where you are with technology, I would think that if you are fairly technologically able from before losing your sight, then there's plenty of scope for you to get involved with different softwares which can help you. NCBI have been very good about this, in that they're well on top of all of the developments and everything that's going on in the modern technological world, and will help and give advice on that, which I found good. Now, I'm not a highly technological person, and bearing in mind that I lost my sight before the modern technological explosion of social media and so on, but I get by. But I would say that even if you don't have any wonderful level of technological skill, there are lots of things that you can learn to do and use. I mean, for example, I use an iPhone, and with voiceover turned on that, I can get by with lots and lots of stuff. But I would say also, for anybody who wants to go to their PC, there's things like NVDA and JAWS, which are hugely beneficial in assisting with working through lots of normal stuff. If you're in the process of just losing sight, you can still see some. There's a product called Zoom Text, again, which NCBI can help you get, which can help you maximize the use of whatever sight you have left. But if it gets beyond that, then you need to probably consider NVDA, which is free. JAWS you'll have to purchase, and I have both in mine, and I'd actually defer to or default to NVDA probably most of the time. So they're the sort of bits of advice. Two basic things. One is technology, and the other is adapting your pre-sight loss skills in whatever way you can. They're probably the two most significant pieces of advice I could give. Oh, sorry, and possibly one other, if I may.
Of course.
Yeah, because using a mobility cane is hugely beneficial. for two reasons. One is that it makes the world at large realise that you cannot see them and they're going to have to make some adjustments, particularly out in the footpath. But particularly, I used a mobility cane for, probably most of 10 years, I think, before I got my guide dog. And I found it wonderful for getting around, but in particular to alert other people and make you feel as though you're not doing something silly, because actions, if you're blind and doing certain things without a cane in your hand, you could look a little bit silly, kind of groping around for something. Whereas if you have a cane in your hand, people immediately know that this person can't see, and it also gets you an easy way of getting assistance as well if you need it. So that is a psychological hurdle for some people, but if that is a hurdle for somebody, I would say do everything you possibly can to overcome your kind of resistance to it and get using it. But once you get using it, you wonder why you ever did without it. So that's just one of the pieces of advice I give.
And thank you for that. And certainly NCBI can offer assistance to anybody who is interested in using a long cane, and can offer long cane training in that regard to maximise people's independence. And I suppose the last question, Robert, I'd be interested in asking you is just in connection with your guide dog, Rona, and how much of a difference that has made to your life. You mentioned you have only had Rona for the last number of years, but what kind of improvements has that made for you?
It has made me much more mobile in getting around, in that I don't have to depend on my cane. In that with my cane, I would have a fair few bumps with things. It depends how well you use it, but in general, you can avoid poles and all sorts of obstacles like that. But the dog is 100% effective on that. In 2 years, I've only had one bump with the dog, whereas with getting around with a cane, I could have had several. So yes. She's excellent at that, finding curb edges. And in general, just my confidence of walking around, I can walk around more freely, in that I don't have to kind of worry about every step. I could actually, well, I can't see now anyway, but I am walking blind, to make just in that I just don't see where I'm going. So I can walk quite confidently with the dog and know that I don't have to worry about bumping into something, whereas the cane, I had to find it. That is a significant difference. So yeah, and there are lots of ways in which the dog kind of understands how to get me around, finding curb edges and turning left and turning right and all that sort of stuff. So that makes life just much more, when I'm out and about, much more, shall we say, fluid for walking.
Great. And obviously, not only does she ensure that you navigate safely and confidently, but it maximizes your independence as well. So you're out and about. And I suppose just to encourage listeners to jump onto the NCBI website to avail of Robert's book. Again, it's called Insights into an Unsighted World, and does provide a list of tips to family members and to friends on how to interact with people who are blind and vision impaired, and then gives insights into Robert's own experiences. But for now, Robert, can I thank you very much for participating in our podcast, and to encourage anybody who is listening that if they wish to avail of NCBI services, as always, they can call the info line 1850 33 43 53. Many thanks, Robert.
Okay, thank you.